Boy returns from death with a terrifying message from heaven in a quiet Nebraska. The Burpo family's life was turned upside down when their young son Colton nearly lost his life during a medical emergency. What happened next was nothing short of a miracle. As Colton awoke, he began recounting vivid details of an incredible journey beyond the grave. He spoke of heavenly visions, encounters with angels, and even meeting Jesus himself. But it wasn't just a peaceful glimpse of paradise. Colton returned with a message that left his family and everyone who heard it stunned, a message far more unsettling than they ever could have imagined. This is the story of a boy who returned from death with a terrifying message from heaven, a revelation that challenges everything we think we know about life, death, and what might lie beyond it. It was a typical spring day in 2003 in Imperial, Nebraska, a small close-knit town where everyone knew each other. The Burpo family, made up of Todd, Sonia, their young son Colton, and his sister Cassie, were like many families in the area. They lived a modest life rooted in faith and community. Todd was a pastor at the local church and had also worked several other jobs to make ends meet. He was a volunteer firefighter, a coach, and a handyman. Despite the demanding schedule, Todd was a devoted father and husband. Sonia, a school teacher, was equally busy balancing her career with caring for the children. For the Burrs' life was hectic, but filled with love and a strong sense of purpose. Colton, at just 4 years old, was a lively, energetic child. He was curious and playful, always asking questions about everything he encountered. His blonde hair and wide smile made him instantly endearing to everyone he met. He loved spending time with his family, especially tagging along with his father. Todd often brought Colton with him on errands around town, and they had a close bond. It was clear that Colton admired his father, often imitating him and wanting to be just like him. Life was busy but good for the Burpo family until a seemingly minor illness began to change everything. In January of that year, Colton came down with a stomach virus. That didn't seem unusual at first. He had been sick with a fever and some stomach pain, which Todd and Sonia assumed was just the flu. But as the days went by, Colton didn't get better. His symptoms worsened, and he began to cry out in pain, clutching his stomach. Sonia became increasingly worried, noticing that his cries were different. They were cries of genuine, excruciating pain. It was unlike anything she had ever heard from her normally tough little boy. Todd and Sonia decided to take Colton to the local family doctor, who examined him but couldn't find anything significantly wrong. The doctor thought it was just a severe case of the stomach flu and advised them to keep Colton hydrated and let it run its course. Todd, trying to keep his family calm, reassured Sonia that everything would be fine, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Over the next few days, Colton's condition deteriorated rapidly. His pain became unbearable, and he could barely stand up without screaming. It was as if his small body was being ripped apart from the inside. Sonia called Todd at work in a panic one afternoon, her voice trembling with fear. Todd, something is wrong. This isn't normal. We need to take him back to the doctor, she said, holding back tears. Todd, feeling a wave of fear he hadn't known before, rushed. They hurried back to the doctor, who this time could see that Colton's condition was critical. He advised them to take him to the hospital immediately. Todd and Sonia drove as fast as they could, their hearts pounding in their chests. Colton lay in the back seat, his face pale, eyes glazed over with pain. It was the longest drive of their lives, filled with silent prayers and sense of dread they couldn't shake. When they arrived at the Great Plains Regional Medical Center, the emergency team took Colton in. Immediately tests revealed that his appendix had burst, something that the family doctor had missed during the initial examination. A ruptured appendix is a life-threatening emergency, especially for a small child. The toxins released into his body had already begun to spread, causing a severe infection. The doctors told Todd and Sonia that Colton's situation was critical. They needed to operate right away to have any chance of saving him. Sonia burst into tears, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all. One moment, they were dealing with what seemed like a routine stomach bug. The next, they were being told their son's life was hanging by a thread. Todd tried to stay strong for his wife and daughter, but inside, he felt like he was crumbling. He wanted to scream, to beg God to spare his child, but he held back. Knowing he had to keep it together for his family, he kissed Colton's forehead before they wheeled him into surgery. "I love you, buddy," he whispered. His voice choked with emotion. Colton, barely conscious, managed a faint smile and said, "I love you too, Daddy." The surgery was intense and lasted much longer than expected. Todd paced the waiting room, unable to sit still. He tried to pray, but he couldn't find the words. Instead, he found himself silently pleading with God, tears streaming down his face as he thought of all the moments he might lose with his son, the games they hadn't played yet, the questions Colton hadn't asked him yet, the dreams they had for his future. He had never felt so helpless. Meanwhile, Colton was undergoing a fight for his life in the operating room. His tiny body had already been weakened by the infection spreading through his abdomen. The surgical team worked frantically trying to remove the toxins and stabilize him. At one point, his heart rate dropped dangerously low, and they feared they were losing him. It was a moment of sheer terror for the medical team, who fought desperately to keep him alive. As the surgery continued, something incredible happened. Colton, who appeared unconscious on the operating table, later described what he experienced during those critical moments. He claimed that he felt himself leave his body. It was as if he was suddenly floating above the operating table, looking down at the doctors working on him. He could see the frantic movements, the beads of sweat on the surgeon's forehead, and the intense focus on their faces. He watched detached, yet aware, as they struggled to save his life. At the same time, Colton said he could see his parents in the waiting room. He described his mother crying on the phone, speaking to family members, her voice filled with panic. He saw his father in a different corner of the room, pacing back and forth, his head bowed as he prayed. Colton later recounted how he could feel his father's fear and anguish, even though he was physically distant from him. It was an inexplicable experience for a child of 4 to describe with such clarity. When Colton awoke after the surgery, Todd and Sonia were relieved, though exhausted and still deeply worried. Married, they sat by his side, holding his hands, whispering words of love and encouragement, but the relief was mixed with a lingering fear. The doctors couldn't guarantee that Colton was out of the woods. He had been through a life-threatening ordeal, and the risk of complications was still high in the days following the surgery. As Colton regained his strength, he began to share his experience with his parents. It started innocently enough. He simply mentioned that he had watched them during the surgery. Todd and Sonia exchanged puzzled looks, not sure what he meant. How could he have seen them in the waiting room when he was under anesthesia fighting for his life? While they pressed him for more details, they were shocked by what he described. Colton knew exactly where they had been standing, what they had been doing, and even snippets of their conversation. He spoke with the matter-of-fact innocence of a child, unaware that what he was saying was impossible for Todd and Sonia. It was as if the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Their son had been near death, but he was describing events he couldn't possibly have seen or known about. They listened in stunned silence as Colton continued. He described being pulled upward away from the hospital room into a place filled with light. He said it felt warm and safe, like nothing he had ever experienced. "I went up to heaven," he said, simply looking at his parents with wide, sincere eyes. Colton's description of heaven began to spill out in bits and pieces. Over the following days, it wasn't something he sat down to tell as a complete story. Instead, it came up in the most unexpected ways. In the middle of conversations about seemingly ordinary things, Sonia and Todd were trying to navigate the shock and exhaustion of what they had just been through, still processing the reality that they nearly lost their son they had prayed so hard, clinging to their faith. But hearing Colton talk about his experience felt like stepping into a new reality altogether. One day, while Colton was resting at home, he casually mentioned seeing a man in heaven. "I saw Pop," he said with the innocent certainty only a child can have. Sonia's breath caught in her throat. "Pop?" she asked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "You mean my dad?" Colton nodded, smiling. "He was really happy to see me," he said. He started to describe the man he had met, the way he looked, his smile, and the warmth in his eyes. The description didn't match any recent photo of Sonia's father that Colton had ever seen. Instead, he described a younger version of the man with dark hair and a strong build. Todd, listening intently, decided to show Colton an old family photo album. He flipped through it slowly, pointing out pictures of people he thought Colton might recognize. When he got to a faded black and white photo of Pop as a young man, Colton's eyes lit up. "That's him," he exclaimed. "That's Pop." Todd and Sonia exchanged a stunned look. Colton had never seen a picture of Pop as a young man. They had only ever shown him pictures from later in life when he was older, and had grey hair. The realization sent a shiver down Sonia's spine. She felt an overwhelming mixture of grief, disbelief, and a strange kind of comfort she couldn't quite put into words. As the days passed, Colton continued to talk about the things he had seen. His descriptions of heaven were simple but profoundly detail-filled, with imagery that seemed both childlike and otherworldly. He spoke about vibrant colors unlike anything he had seen before, describing a sky that seemed to glow without a sun. He talked about the music he heard, not just ordinary songs, but a kind of harmony that filled him with a sense of joy and peace beyond what he had ever felt on earth. He said, "The light wasn't like the light we have here. It didn't come from one place, but seemed to shine from everything around him." One afternoon, while they were sitting together, Colton mentioned something that left his parents in silent shock. "I met my sister," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Todd and Sonia were puzzled. Cassie, Colton's older sister, was at school. They assumed that's who he was talking about, but Colton shook his head. "No, not Cassie." He explained, "I met my other sister." The room fell silent as his words sank in. Sonia's face went pale, and her eyes filled with tears. She knew instantly what Colton was saying, but it seemed impossible. How could he know? Years before Colton was born, Sonia had suffered a miscarriage. It was a painful experience, one she and Todd rarely spoke about, even to each other. They had never told Colton about it. He was too young to understand, and they didn't want to burden him with the sadness of that loss. Yet here he was talking about his sister he had never been told existed. Sonia's hands trembled as she asked him gently, "What did she look like?" Colton's eyes lit up as he described her. "She had dark hair, like yours, Mommy," he said, "and she was really, really happy. She hugged me and told me she couldn't wait for you to come to heaven someday." Sonia couldn't hold back her tears. She broke down sobbing, overwhelmed by the sudden wave of emotions. It was as if all the grief she had buried deep inside her heart was being unearthed. At once Todd pulled her into his arms. Feeling his own tears welling up, they had mourned that loss quietly, privately. And here was their little boy speaking about it with such certainty, with details he couldn't possibly have known. It felt like a message from beyond, a small glimpse of a life they had lost, but was somehow still there, waiting for them. Colton didn't understand why his parents were crying to him. It had been a happy reunion. "She said she's okay," he told them earnestly. "She's not sad. She loves you both so much." The words hit Sonia like a physical blow. It was the kind of reassurance she had longed for, but never dared to hope for. She realized then that if what Colton was saying was true, it meant that their lost child wasn't really lost. She was safe, happy, and waiting for them in a place filled with love. The revelation changed something in Todd as well. He had been struggling with his own doubts, trying to reconcile his faith with the harsh realities of the world. He had spent countless hours as a pastor comforting others, assuring them of God's love and the promise of heaven. But secretly he had carried his own fears and uncertainties. Hearing Colton talk about his sister, seeing the raw truth in his son's eyes, felt like a gift. It was a confirmation of everything he had preached, but never fully allowed himself to believe. It was as if God was speaking to him through Colton, giving him a glimpse of the divine plan, a reminder that even the smallest lives were part of something much greater. Over time, Colton's stories continued to unfold, each revelation more startling than the last. One day, while sitting on the couch with his father, he casually mentioned meeting a man who had told him how much he loved him. He had big, strong hands, Colton said, and he smiled a lot. Todd couldn't place who Colton might be talking about, so he asked for more details. Colton looked up, his eyes shining. "It was Jesus," he said simply. "He's really nice, Daddy. He loves everyone." Todd's heart skipped a beat. He had always taught his children about Jesus, but to hear his son speak of meeting him face to face was almost too much to comprehend. "What did Jesus look like?" Todd asked quietly, half afraid of what Colton might say. The boy paused, as if searching for the right words. "He had brown hair and a beard," he began, and his eyes were like the ocean. They were full of love, like he knew everything about me, but still loved me anyway. Colton's description was simple but profound. He talked about how Jesus wore a white robe with a purple sash, and that he had markers on his hands and feet. Todd felt a shiver run down his spine. He knew what Colton meant by markers: the scars from the crucifixion, the wounds from the nails. It was a detail that Colton couldn't have known. A piece of the story he was too young to fully understand, yet he spoke about it with the confidence of someone who had seen it for himself. "What did Jesus say to you, Todd?" asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Colton's expression turned serious, as if he was recalling something very important. He told me it wasn't my time, yet he said I had to go back. Because he had work for me to do. The boy's voice was calm, but his words carried a weight that left Todd speechless. He pulled Colton into his arms, holding him close, as if he could protect him from the enormity of what he was saying. It felt like they were standing on sacred ground, teetering between the world they knew and something far beyond their comprehension. Sonia joined them, wrapping her arms around her husband and son. They sat there in silence, the three of them huddled together, trying to absorb the magnitude of what they were hearing. It was a moment that changed them forever. It was no longer just a story about a near-death experience. It was a message, a glimpse of heaven, and a reassurance that their faith was not in vain. For the Burpo family, it was the beginning of a new journey, one that would challenge their beliefs, deepen their faith, and set them on a path